Welcome to the Laverne Church of the Brethren's weekly audio message. Here at the Laverne Church of the Brethren, we create a Christian community called by Christ to be inclusive, caring, and peace-minded. We affirm that people of any race, ethnic identity, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, age, economic status, faith tradition, or life situation are welcome in our congregation. We believe in compassionate service, stewardship of creation, respect for diversity, and nonviolent reconciliation for differences among all people, nations, and faith traditions. We claim no creed but the New Testament as exemplified by the life of Christ. We strive to follow the way of Jesus. And through these efforts, we seek to grow ever closer to the mind and heart of God. And now let us ground ourselves as we enter into today's message.
Today's second scripture reading is taken from John 12, verses 12 through 16. The next day, the great crowd that had come to the festival heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel." Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, as it is written, "Do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt." His disciples did not understand these things at first, but when Jesus was glorified, they remembered that these things had been written of him and had been done to him.
If it seems like things are a little disorganized this morning, this is what happens when the interim co-pastor plans the service. We have guest musicians, and I thought, I have the hymns taken care of, but seem to have forgotten to assign the offertory. So I'm mea culpa, just say it. The first Easter cantata that I remember from my youth had a section in it that had the following words describing Jesus. "He went about doing good and helping where'er he could. An example is he, a great pattern for me, for he went about doing good." Right on cue. So you might wonder how such a nice guy ran afoul of the Romans and the religious leaders of the time. All he did was went about doing good. So this season of Lent, whether Amanda Bennett has been preaching or myself, we have tried to communicate in various scriptures that it was more than an unhappy accident that Jesus was killed. In living out the heart of God, channeling the compassion that God has for human beings, Jesus came into conflict with religious authorities and threatened the Pax Romana, the peace with no justice that Rome inflicted upon their conquered territories. Religious festivals were tense times in Jerusalem. The festivals commemorated times when God acted powerfully on behalf of the people of Israel. The most tense of these festivals was the feast of the Passover. Because what did Passover commemorate? A time when God acted decisively to free the people of Israel from oppressors. In that case, Egyptians. So when hundreds of devout Jews descend upon the holy city for Passover, They are reminded of God's activity in the past, and they hope, against hope, that this might be the year that God might act again to free them, this time from the Romans. And with all those extra people, and they're seeing each other, they're seeing friends they haven't seen for a year perhaps, and maybe a little extra wine has been flowing, the Passover out-of-towners might look at the Roman soldiers and think, "Oh, I think that the sons of thunder and I can take those soldiers over there. And once we act, God will be forced to rescue us, just like in old times at the Passover." To dampen the enthusiasm of Passover celebrants, extra Roman soldiers were sent out of Caesarea on the coast to try to dissuade uprisings. Could I have the first slide? Additional cohorts were sent from Caesarea. A cohort was 6 centuries of men. Now, you would think that each century of men would mean 100 men, because that's what century means to us. It's 100 years, right? And that was originally the case. But the Roman Empire had expanded so much, and there were budget cuts, and they had trouble recruiting the soldiers they needed, and there was inflation. So the century cohort was down to 60 to 80 men. No longer a century, but 6 centuries of men in each cohort, and additional cohorts were sent from Caesarea to Jerusalem. And the whole point was to dissuade the Israelites from thinking about resisting. And as they would go through the sleepy little towns on the way to Jerusalem, they wouldn't go quietly. They would march, and sometimes they would take their shields and clang them against the ground just to make extra noise, to draw attention to this. Clank, clank, clank as they marched. Clank, clank, clank. And everyone heard them, just like the drag racers. And they would see these Roman soldiers imposing with all their gear and their swords and their shields, and some with horses. And the whole point of it was for the Romans to say to the people of Israel, "You're thinking about rioting? Go ahead, make our day." Or better yet, don't even think about it. So give me the next slide. The inhabitants of the villages were peasants. They were laborers eking out a subsistence living, hoping to get enough food to get by each day. They were people who worked with their hands, probably mostly masons for Herod's grand building projects. And they worked hard every day, and they were mostly fueled by a couple of barley cakes that they would take with them. I'm not exactly sure what barley cakes are like, but I think they might be a little bit like rice cakes. If you've ever eaten a rice cake, it's a little bit like biting into styrofoam. And you get to the end of the rice cake, and you've just taken in just enough calories to get up out of the chair and stagger to the refrigerator for more food. That's what I have in my mind about barley cakes. Neighboring countries disparaged the Israelites by calling them barley cake eaters. They would work all day with just a couple of barley cakes to give them strength, and they would have gnawing hunger day after day. It never quite filled them up, a gnawing hunger and a growing resentment when they would see the well-fed Roman soldiers march by threateningly. Next slide. The last person in the procession would be the governor Pilate. He would ride on a white horse, which was a war horse, again, threatening the people, don't even think about resisting. He would come to major feasts along with the additional cohorts, and they would be temporarily quartered in the praetorium within Jerusalem. So he's riding on the white horse of war, and he and the cohorts would enter from the west side of Jerusalem because that is where the praetorium was located. Next slide. Meanwhile, on the east side of Jerusalem, the disciples have been asked to find the colt of a donkey for Jesus to ride. So you might think, wow, what humility for Jesus not even to ride a full-grown donkey, but just a baby donkey. But wait, next slide. There's a prophecy. Part of it was read earlier. Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. The king is coming on a donkey. And I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall speak peace to the nations. His rule shall be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. It's this prophecy about a king entering Jerusalem, coming in peace, proclaiming peace. But the people in their excitement for Jesus entering Jerusalem erupt in a sea of green palms and exultations of Hosanna. Next slide. A sea of green and celebration, shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. And Hosanna means save. And not just save, but save now. Not tomorrow, not next year, not in the next generation. Save now. Next slide, please. So in Jesus Christ Superstar, the writer has the people singing, Hosanna! Hey, JC, JC, will you fight for me? They were expecting a king to drive out those Romans that were lording it over them. The priests hear the shouts of Hosanna, and the priests are worried. They've seen this before. They've seen what the Romans do when people get excited about being delivered. Again, in Jesus Christ Superstar, Caiaphas, the high priest, who, strangely enough, has a really deep bass voice, which I don't have, but he sings, Tell the rabble to be quiet. I anticipate a riot. This common crowd is much too loud. And then what does Jesus respond? If these remain silent, the stones will cry out. The very stones will cry out. Now, going through East Jerusalem, they may have been going past some graveyards. Some of the Jewish people in that day believed in the resurrection from the dead. And they also believed that when the Messiah was revealed, that graves would open up and the resurrected folks would join in the resistance to throw the Romans out of their country. So when the priests heard Jesus say, the stones will cry out, they were even more worried. Any kind of uprising would undercut the way they had arranged temple life, and also colluding with the Roman captors that had given the priests and their families a very prosperous living. Note the ominous clouds in this painting. The last time I saw clouds like that in real life, there was a tornado nearby. Next slide. The Temple Mount in this graphic is the section that looks like it's demarked by red hazard lines. The gray area to the left of the Temple Mount is where the praetorium was located, along the edge of the city. You notice that they're close by. And there's a reason for that, because when stuff went down, it was usually associated with the temple. Something was going on at the temple. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke have Jesus overturning the money changers' tables at the temple during this Passover. The religious leaders of the time are extremely worried. Nothing they have done to this point has enabled them to trip Jesus up and make him lose popularity. Next slide. So the Pharisees said to one another, "Look, the world has gone after him. What are we going to do?" Next slide. Amidst the joyful pleas of the people for Jesus to save them now, Jesus, on the donkey in the center of this picture, Jesus weeps over Jerusalem and says, "Would that you would know the things that make for peace." Now, in this portrayal, you may not be able to see it from back there, there are people waving flags from a number of different countries, and it's if the artist is trying to tell us all this nationalism is killing God's hopes for a peaceful and loving humanity. Next slide. So within these two pictures are two different ways of using power. Power over versus power with. Conquering people and lording it over them versus beckoning people to follow and showing lordship by serving one another. Overpowering versus empowering. Which way will we choose today? Which way will we choose this coming week? Which way will we choose with the rest of our lives? In our work, in our friendships, in our marriages, in the way we organize church life. Next slide. Things did not turn out well for Jesus after Palm Sunday. Everyone misunderstood his message of peace and reconciliation. He died a death of state-enacted terror on a cross. As one hymn writer from the 19th century put it, "See from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. Did e'er such love and sorrow meet, or thorns compose so rich a crown?" Next slide. The cross is a bit of a mixed symbol for me. On the one hand, it's a sign of God's love for us, but it's also an instrument of state terror. This Thursday at 6 p.m., we will celebrate the Last Supper with symbols that Jesus chose. The basin and the towel, or how I think Jesus chose to be remembered. Now, if you come Thursday night, you don't have to wash feet if you don't want to. There are also symbolic hand-washing stations, or you can participate as an observer. But Jesus invites us to do this, as he's recorded as saying in John 13, verse 14 and 15. "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you also should do just as I have done to you." So Jesus invites us to the basin and the towel, a reminder of his life of humility, compassion, healing, and service. A life for us to follow.
We're so glad that you listened to the message today. If you're looking for an open and affirming, peace-loving, and justice-seeking congregation, consider visiting us for in-person worship on Sundays at 9:30 a.m. We'd love to meet you.